Thank you, Joanna. So thank you everyone for joining us today for this Lianza webcast on why the future of the library isn't what you think it is. And I wanted to start today with a quote by Vint Cerf. And Vint's a very interesting man. He's considered to be one of the fathers of the internet. He's got more than a dozen honorary degrees in addition to his actual PhD in computer science. And he says, "You have no idea how eager I am to ensure that the notion of library does not disappear. It's too important." Vint is also Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google. So when you're thinking about the future of libraries, remember that even Google is on your side. But really, I included this quote because the idea or notion of what constitutes a library features really strongly when you're thinking about what the future of libraries actually is. Because speculation about what the future of libraries is rife. And it's so rife that in 2013, the American Library Association actually announced the formation of a Centre for the Future of Libraries. And whatever you think the future of libraries is, it's both more complex and more simple than I think most of us have been able to imagine so far. So all good presentations should tell you what they're going to talk about. So this is what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to talk about speculation, terrible advice, and some crystal ball gazing. And ironically, I'm not joking about any of these things. So firstly, we're going to talk about speculation. So why is there so much speculation about what the future of the libraries might be? And why do some people, particularly the media, why are they so convinced that the library is in some kind of death spiral? And why do certain sectors of society think that the time for libraries has come? Then secondly, I'm going to talk about what commentators normally say about the future of the library and how we're told to prepare for that future, and why I think that is essentially terrible advice. And then thirdly, I'm going to go into some theories about how we can begin to predict or make some educated guesses about what might happen in the future. So speculation, terrible advice, and then some crystal ball gazing. Now, in preparing for this presentation, I read a lot of articles about the future of libraries. And I collected so many articles, in fact, that I didn't actually manage to read all of them over the month that I was doing research into this presentation. But what I did realise is that I came to two conclusions about that. And the first is that everyone has an opinion on what the library of the future might or might not be. And secondly, not all of those opinions are equal. It was really obvious when I was reading some of those pieces that a lot of the commentators hadn't been into a library for a while. And I think if you haven't been into a library for a while, your ability to comment usefully on the future of libraries is pretty limited. And that's not because you don't have a valid opinion about libraries, but your thoughts about what a library is or can be is very much tied up in a concept of a library that hasn't actually existed for quite a few years. And because of that, the kind of ideas they can generate about what the library of the future can be is quite limited. There are lots of commentators that have got a lot of fond memories for libraries, and it's really heartwarming, but they tend to see a much more limited future for us. Those who regularly use their libraries and they're much more involved in the world around them, including their local communities, are much more likely to see a wider role for libraries. Of course, there wouldn't be so much pondering about the future of the libraries if it wasn't such a hot topic. And the media outlets love to run stories on the demise of libraries. They're seemingly quite an easy target. I don't actually think that apart from booksellers, I don't think I've ever seen any other profession treated in quite the same way. Rolly Keating, who's the director of the British Library, said he's shocked at how many smart people still question whether libraries are viable in this modern age. But if you've been watching what happens in the UK with the closure of libraries, chances are you might think they have a point. And sadly, this slide is actually a genuine closure notice from a UK library. Even in the US, while there haven't been as many closures, library budgets have still been slashed. Fortunately, the tide in the media is starting to turn a little bit about how library futures are reported. So a lot of high-profile people who are in a really good position to comment Notably, people like the director of the New York Public Library and Roly Keating from the British Library have started to do so, and they're now commenting quite loudly and publicly, which I think is not before time. So why have libraries been considered to be under threat at all? And there are some obvious reasons why people might think this. The first is the internet, and this seems like a really obvious one. However, if we consider that the internet has been around for more than 20 years, it seems a little bit rich for us to keep banging on this drum. In fact, my opinion is that the internet and libraries are actually an excellent match for each other. Ebooks is the other common reason that libraries are considered to be under threat. And like the internet, they've most definitely changed the way that we operate, but they haven't completely revolutionised or undermined what we do. So a UK report identified, for example, that 62% of 16 to 24-year-olds favour print over the digital equivalent. The Washington Post reported in February this year that college students bought 87% of their books in print and just 9% bought ebooks. And the Pew Research Centre studies show that the highest print readership rates are amongst those that we would think would be most attuned to ebooks, digital natives. This quote from Brad Lunick, he's the Executive Director of Canon Design's Global Education Practice. And I included this because it really shows how people have predicted that demise of libraries, but actually in doing that, they haven't understood exactly how the emerging technology can enable us as libraries to transform the way that we learn and the way that we create knowledge, both in the physical realm and in the digital realm. So if it's not the internet or ebooks, why does that speculation on the future of libraries keep continuing? Well, one reason I think is value and how society measures our value. So for most of Western society at this time, value means something that's economic, something that's got a value dollar attached. There are other ways of measuring value, but economic value tends to stand head and shoulders above, say, social or cultural value at this time in our history. Inside organisations, often the only other kinds of value or measures that come close are reputation and risk when we're thinking about how we value something. And if you're a library, particularly in the government sector, you probably will have been listening to talks about value for money for years and years. This focus on economic value has what's caused libraries to try and develop things like return on investment models. So they posit that for every dollar you put into a library, it returns so many dollars back into the community. And there's been quite a lot of success in that, but we really get to measure how libraries add value in other ways. So measuring the returns on a cultural or a social or a heritage type of institution is often quite tricky. It can be done, but it's difficult. So how do you measure the impact libraries have on, for example, mitigating social isolation, or reading for pleasure, or connecting new immigrants with family back home via Facebook, or helping someone set up an email account so they can apply for a job? They're all quite qualitative things to a degree, and they can't easily be measured. But as someone quite smart once said, not everything that counts can be counted. Related to this is the cycle of investment and use of libraries, or rather the cycle of underinvestment and often underuse. So it's a common argument that's put forward by those with the purse strings that libraries aren't used anymore, and you particularly see this in local government when they're talking about public libraries. And often there's three things going on here. Firstly, the argument's often made by people who don't visit the library very frequently. Secondly, that investment argument's often made because it's based on some statistics. And in some ways, we've painted ourselves into a little bit of a corner with this. So we've traditionally used usage or people through the door as a kind of benchmark for our libraries, a way of measuring the value. And for many of us now, in the age of internet and ebooks, those stats are declining. And that's not necessarily because we're less busy or because we add less value into our communities, or necessarily even because we have less usage overall. But how our customers use the library is changing. That pattern of use is different, and trying to convey that when we've been using lots of standard measures for a long time is quite difficult. Thirdly, organisations that underinvest in libraries typically get libraries that underperform. It is a bit of a generalisation, but if a parent organisation is constantly making cuts, they don't allow very much in the way of investment into infrastructure or buildings or technology, as well as trying to constrain library budgets and hours, then naturally usage is going to drop off regardless of how good the service is. Because people like to be in modern, bright spaces with a variety of resources and the convenience of long opening hours. They're attuned to like that because of new technologies like the internet, where they can get a variety of resources at any time of the day or night. The proof of this is that new and renovated library spaces are normally met with huge surges in numbers of patrons, much to the surprise of local councils. Next, we've got nostalgia. And nostalgia is a slightly sad reason for the obsession with the decline of the library, and I've touched on this briefly already. It's very much usually linked to the childhood library of the writer or the decision maker, which often turns out to be a place of stern librarians and dusty books and silence. And nostalgia is kind of sad, not only because the libraries of these childhoods, they only exist in the mind of the writer, and it's also a sure sign that they probably haven't been near a library since before the internet. John Palfrey from the Berkman Centre for Internet and Society says, one of the greatest threats to libraries is nostalgia. The way that we, the loving public, associate libraries with the pleasures of a bygone era and assume that the growth of the internet is slowly draining libraries of their usefulness. The final reason I'm going to look at is that libraries appear to be under threat because libraries are unlikely. So imagine for a moment that libraries didn't exist. Would we create a library to fulfill the particular functions that a library provides? Now, for some kinds of libraries, particularly those perhaps with a specialist focus, perhaps we would create a library. But say for an academic or a public library that's got so many roles and services, for example, digital literacy, internet access, reading for pleasure, baby rock and rhyme, summer reading programs, author visits, perhaps we wouldn't create a library to fill those functions if we were starting from scratch. Libraries are quite an anomaly in the current day and age. They're a public good in a society that doesn't have very many public good services left. They fulfill a function in a way we probably wouldn't think of if we created a new service. And when people are commentating on the future of libraries, that often creates quite a lot of discomfort for the mind of the commentator. So let's leave behind a little bit of the speculation and look at the future. So the premise of this talk, of course, is why the future of the library isn't what you think it is. So why isn't it what you think it is? The first reason, and it's probably quite an obvious one, is that not all libraries are the same. And yet, all the commentators continue to talk about the future of the libraries as if it's one coherent future that all libraries are going to share. And that ultimately is very unlikely. So libraries are part of the communities that they serve. And our libraries will all be the same at the point that all our communities are the same. Of all the reading I did, there was probably only one author that actually pointed this out, and that was Vaughan Tan, who's a member of Harvard's University Library Project. And he said, every library should figure out what they want to be and just do that. And I think we could probably rewrite that slightly to say every library should figure out what their community wants to be and just do that. The future, I think, is also not what we think it is, because the world changes and turns in ways we can't predict. It's unpredictable. There's a lot of talk, for example, about the power of disruptive technology. For example, things like the iPhone, which managed to disrupt not just the phone market, but the laptop market as well. And disruptive technology is just that. The next wave of it hasn't even been invented yet. Technology is designed to have a short life cycle and to foster change and that constant cycle of having to buy new things. And I discovered this recently, much to my great disappointment, when I got a Fitbit for Mother's Day and discovered that it wouldn't sync with my phone. My phone, that's only 2.5 years old and still in perfect working condition, is too old now to talk to a newer device. Now, if we turn that on its head, we often believe the hype about things that are going to completely redefine the library landscape, and often they don't. So, for example, ebooks. Yes, ebooks have absolutely changed some aspects about how we work, but have they changed our core values? Fundamentally, no, and nor did the home PC or the internet or the tablet or the smartphone. So sometimes we believe the hype about how much of an impact things are going to have on us. Conversely, we sometimes underestimate the longevity of some things. So the book as a format has had an extraordinarily long life. Libraries themselves have been around since about 2300 BC, and that's not a reason for complacency, but just a thought to keep in mind that the value of libraries about sharing knowledge has actually endured across the ages. Next, we've got the environment that we work in. So the local, national, and international environment affects us all more than we would probably like to admit. Things like the global financial crisis, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, intellectual property, copyright law, they all affect us to a great degree. And sometimes we underestimate how much they're going to impact on us. Also, and you'll have seen this happen quite often, if someone in an overseas library is doing something, you can guarantee that someone who's in a decision-making position in your organisation will ask why you're not doing it. Then there seem to be so many choices about what we could do, but we don't always differentiate between the relatively stable and predictable changes that might be coming up. For example, shifting demography inside a community, and disruptive change like technology. Now, because the future of libraries can't be accurately predicted, what tends to happen is that people make generalisations about what we need to do to meet the challenges of the future. And if you read something on the future of libraries or technology, this is the general kind of slant that you'll get. So here is just kind of a bucket list of the sorts of recommendations I found when I was reading. And some of these will look pretty familiar. So provide what your customers want, that good customer focus, keeping up with technology, thinking about where your customers are or being mobile, collaborating and partnering. And then some slightly more library-oriented suggestions about providing creative and diverse spaces, hacker spaces and maker labs, and community programming. Now, I'd have to say for some of these things, or all of them, that this advice is possibly not terribly helpful. They are the usual suspects. None of this advice is necessarily wrong, but it focuses us on things that are very generic. Focusing on the customer, obviously, is really central to what we do. Keeping up with technology helps us to provide customers with what they want. So none of the advice is actually wrong, but it's so incredibly general that it's of almost no use. The first 4 statements there about customers, technology, mobility and collaboration, they can probably apply to just about every customer-facing industry in the world. They're things that simply are just expected in the 21st century. So if these are the generic recommendations that we get, how do we get past those recommendations into what the future might look like? While the future's unpredictable, I think there are 3 areas we can look at that will give us a good handle on where the future of libraries might go. Firstly, we can look at our own context. That includes the local, the national, and the international context that we live in. Secondly, we can look at the role that our libraries play in our communities, and that's different between different sectors. So clearly a medical library is going to play a much different role to an academic library to, say, the National Library. And we need to be really clear about what those roles are for our community, or in business speak, for our stakeholders. And then finally, we can look at trends in the wider environment. There are lots of trends out there that are really attractive, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're right for us. So where I work in a special government library, there's zero need for a 3D printer or a makerspace. It doesn't matter how cool it is, it's just not something we need. So if we think about these 3 things, we get what I would call a possible formula for how we might predict what the future of libraries is. We look at the context that we're in, our environment. We think about what the role is in our community, and then we look at the trends that apply to us, and we get what might be a possible future outcome. So let's start off by having a look at the context that we work in, and I'm going to use a model that's quite common, the PESTLE or sometimes PESTLE model it's called, that helps us to understand the landscape. So if we think for a moment about some examples of each of these and how they're currently affecting us. So politically, internationally, we have things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. Nationally, we may have, for example, changes to policy on benefits, and that might impact who comes into our library to job hunt or who returns to study. Economically, on a worldwide scale, we've got the after effects of the global financial crisis. Nationally, we've got government caps on the number of New Zealand students that will fund, and then the impact that has on the bottom line of universities. If you live in a smaller centre and a major employer closes, that then has an impact on the employment rate in your community and the amount of disposable income that people have and the people who might be looking for jobs. Socially, New Zealand's got an ageing population as the baby boomers retire. We've also got a lot of young people coming into the workplace that have always had Google and think of themselves as being digitally literate. We've got a large population of new New Zealanders, particularly in Auckland, and then we have an increasing trend of reverse migration of people going from urban to rural centres. Technologically, well, where to start? So we've got, for example, the rollout of ultra-fast broadband, storage capacity doubling every 12 months, storage getting cheaper, but it making less and less different because we're producing 2.5 quintillion bytes of data daily. Despite that, in the technological arena, Anthony Marks, who's the president and CEO of the New York Public Library, makes a really good point that technology now enables us to potentially fulfill our mission at an exponentially higher level. In the legal environment, we've got things again like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but the intellectual property clauses and the impact that that's going to have on our copyright legislation at the national level. We also have ongoing changes to the Local Government Act and its impact on public libraries. And then on a really local level, we're faced with a variety of purchasing models around things like ebooks. Licensing rather than ownership can completely change how we operate our business. Then finally, we've got the environmental impacts and things that are happening nationally and globally in trends such as sustainable communities and the slow movement. Now, if we add to that the cycle of change for each of these particular dimensions. So technologically, the rate of change is phenomenally fast and it's often characterised by disruptive change. Legally, the rate of change might be quite slow and that's often aligned with political changes. Socially, changes tend to build over time through generations, but technology can radically shift that behaviour in years rather than generations. So if you take privacy and social media, for example, who would have predicted that we would be documenting our every move in public in 140 characters on Twitter? If you want to see an example of what this kind of analysis looks like in practice, the UK Arts Council did a very interesting document called Envisioning the Library of the Future, and that looks at these kinds of trends and survey results in the UK context. Many of them are either applicable to New Zealand or they can point to good things that you can look for when you're doing your own analysis. As an example of how some of these things play out in practice, in 2013, Bibliotheque opened, and Bibliotheque is the first bookless public library in the United States. They opened in San Antonio, Texas, and their particular environment that they are serving in is one where they have an extremely dispersed community, and that community can't necessarily get to a physical branch. This is the right answer for them, to have a bookless library where you've got that kind of dispersed community. So we've looked at the first part of our equation about that context. The next thing we're going to think about is what our role is in the community. Again, there isn't a single answer to this question because every community is obviously different, and secondly because libraries tend to fulfil a number of roles in each different community. I'm hoping that many of you have seen the work done by Lianza on Libraries Aotearoa, because this material puts together really succinctly the main roles that libraries play in their communities. While many of the library roles have been quite static over time, we can expect that in the future we'll start to add additional roles to the ones that we currently have, and in some sectors we already have started doing this. So for the purposes of this presentation, I've chosen to pick out a few of the less common roles that are starting to appear in the literature about the future of libraries, rather than going over the traditional roles that we've played so far. So I'm going to look at 7 different areas about roles that we might play into the future. Shannon Matten is an associate professor in the School of Media Studies at the New School in New York, and she writes frequently on library spaces. And she talks about libraries as opportunity institutions, particularly with public libraries. They're often seen as opening the doors to and for the disenfranchised. Next, we've got libraries as social infrastructure, and there have been lots of reports about this. For example, libraries are sometimes used as a refuge, and you see this after the Tokyo earthquakes in New York during the hurricanes. Even the libraries in Christchurch became hubs for help, services, and community after the earthquakes. Even during the recent flooding in Wellington, the Central Library opened its doors to those with nowhere to go. So they form a social infrastructure piece in the community. The Sendai Mediathek is a library in Japan that's been described as a cultural refuge. And we've got a number of places and specialist libraries in New Zealand that could be described as having this as part of their role. For example, institutions such as the Alexander Turnbull Library, that is one of those cultural institutions. The next one we've got there is learning hubs, and while learning hubs aren't a particularly new idea in the academic world in particular, this concept's now spreading to a lot of the other sectors. So the New York Public Library is actually using some of its branches specifically as learning hubs for Coursera, who are one of the largest providers of MOOCs. We've got a potential role for the library as a space of exception. And this idea comes from Barbara Pfister, and she's from the Gustavus Adolphus College. Libraries are not, she says, or at least should not be, engines of productivity. If anything, they should slow people down and seduce them with the unexpected, the irrelevant, the odd, and the unexplainable. Productivity is a destructive way to justify the individual's value in a system that is naturally communal, not an individualistic or entrepreneurial zero-sum game to be won by the most industrious. This idea as the library of a space of exception is almost the complete antithesis of the value that we're normally told to provide as a library. Next, we've got the idea of the library's platform, and this concept from David Weinberger expands the idea of open access into libraries as open platforms. This could include things like libraries opening up their entire collections, all of their metadata, and any technologies they've created, and allowing anyone to build new products and services on top of that foundation. A really similar model is already being used in some aspects of government in the United Kingdom. So rather than create apps for the public, the UK government choose to release all their data, then they let the market find where that demand is, and they create the app on top of that. So the government becomes the platform that the knowledge is built on top of. Finally, we've got the idea of library as symbol, and the library can act as a symbol for a society or population, and it often demonstrates what we value as a society. So in the US, the Library of Congress is quite a potent symbol, as is the tradition of US presidential libraries. In the New Zealand context, some of our unique libraries, such as the National Library and the parliamentary library, are symbols of democracy and culture and valuing heritage and valuing history. So remember, this is not a complete list, it's just some additional perspectives on the role that libraries can play. So we've looked at our role in the community. The next in that part of the equation is trends. Now, trends is often where we spend a lot of our energy because trends tend to be new and exciting and full of lots of opportunity. One of the challenges with trends, and particularly technology trends, is that those trends are often solutions. So normally when we're providing a service, we pose the question and we'd say, what's the problem that we're trying to solve?
And technology trends are quite difficult because often they're saying to us, here's a solution to a problem that you didn't even know that you had. Now again, for the trends, I haven't spent a lot of time on the very common trends, things like mobility, for example, but rather I've picked out a few that aren't necessarily heard about that often, but I think are really highly relevant to the future of libraries. As we're going through, I also want to encourage everyone to think really critically about the trends because, like opinions, not all trends are created equally in terms of the future of libraries. So the first trend to watch is really the Instagram effect. So this talks about our ability to not only have an experience, but also the way that we want to share that experience. That ability to compose and frame an experience is almost as important as actually having the experience itself. People want to be able to share, they want to be able to generate a bit of envy in that sharing, and they want to be able to tell people all about it. One commentator has kind of characterised this for the library world as the aim being to move libraries from places where you look at facts to where you learn, those places you learn skills and engage in new experiences, to which I would add, and share those experiences. The next trend is currencies of change. And currencies of change posits that good behaviour is no longer just its own reward. So for example, many of us believe that reading and education and learning new things should be its own reward. But in the current environment, the trend is to incentivise things that inherently should already be good for us. So I think the Lianza Children's Book Awards are actually a really good example of this. Reading, we might say for kids, is a reward in itself, but if you add books and pizza, you can actually add a lot more, get a lot more reading out of those same kids. So you're incentivising something that's essentially already good for them. Another example of this is the rise of Fitbit technology. So yes, exercise is good for you, but having a bit of competition with yourself on a day-to-day basis or with others is actually extremely appealing. Our next trend is about collective impact. And collective impact looks at how we enable large-scale social change. And it does this by thinking about broad cross-sector coordination. So as libraries, we're often told that we need to collaborate for effectiveness and value for money. But collective impact looks at a far wider range of social issues and a far wider range of agencies and levels of coordination. It's basically collaboration, but on a major scale against looking at some major issues in society. Next, and I've touched on this a little bit already, we have the hacking and making trends. And I think there are a couple of levels to this. So for example, the New York Public Library run a digital lab, and that's essentially an experimental unit for developing ideas and tools for digital research. And they're finding new ways to bridge the gap between technology and the collections that they've got. And that kind of looks like the first step of David Weinberger's Library as Platform. Meanwhile, you've got hackerspaces, which are, or really have become mainstream. And hackerspaces are really about those communities. They're sharing spaces, they're sharing tools, and they've got that passion for learning. The members all bring their disciplines together to build something new. And it's about the sharing of knowledge, which works extremely well with the values of libraries. Both of these are connected into the general maker culture of today. So the maker movement is really a common term just used to describe that diffusion of spaces and tools and collaborative application of knowledge to create new enterprises or new physical things. There are some great sites out there where you can check out the kinds of things that makerspaces do or can produce. Places like makeymakey.com or Pinocchio. But aside from the technology-focused maker culture, the rise of sites like Etsy show that making, both in a traditional and a non-traditional kind of way, are immensely popular. Also, critically, for things like hackerspaces and makerspaces, there are things that also need to be grappled with. So 3D printers are a really big trend at the moment. And I think that lots of libraries are getting into. But in an age where anyone can print out a 3D copy of almost anything, what happens to things like intellectual property? So while some of these trends have a lot of potential, there's also a lot of ethical things that we need to be grappling with at the same time. The next trend is the Internet of Things, or what's sometimes also called the global brain. Now, the Internet of Things is reportedly already here, and it's estimated that by 2020, over 30 billion devices will be connected to each other. The premise of the Internet of Things is really that all of those inanimate objects that you have can communicate with each other. Having said that, and thinking critically about the trends again, remember that the things need to be able to communicate with each other. And that's only possible if you have standardization of protocols between those things. And that's one quite big barrier to the Internet of Things actually becoming a true force. Your alarm clock can only communicate with your coffee maker if it has a shared protocol that it can do that with. So while the Internet of Things is reportedly already here, it's only here in a quite limited way at the moment. Next, we've got crowdfunding. So crowdfunding is a huge trend, although it's had somewhat of a slow start in New Zealand. But globally, the growth of crowdfunding was 167% in 2014, and it's here and it looks like it's likely to stick around. In New Zealand, we've got Pledge Me, and they recently hit the $5 million mark in crowdfunding. And one of their standout cases probably has to be the case of Yeasty Boys, who produce beer. They put up a 12.5% stake in their business to raise $500,000, and they raised $500,000 in half an hour. Worldwide, crowdfunding is predicted that in 2015, it will raise $34.4 billion. It's a huge opportunity that we as libraries should be thinking about. Next, we've got trends in education. Obviously, we've got things like mobile education, and while not new, these kind of growth of both disruptive technologies and things like dedicated social media MBA programs and different kinds of education in social media and mobile education has really redefined learning. Mobile education itself is valued to be worth by 2020 about $70 billion US. Like the Internet of Things, MOOCs, I think, are an area to watch as we ask ourselves, for example, if something's free, what value does it have? What value will society put on those MOOCs? Tied into this are changes to how we deliver that education. So not just in the online space, but also in the physical space as well. One of the trends that I came across as I was looking through articles was about flipped learning. And flipped learning is about a form of blended learning where the students, instead of going to lectures with a physical lecturer, they watch lecture videos outside of the class to learn the content, and then they do their homework in the class with the teachers. So completely turned around to our normal model. And this approach helps to engage the students outside of the classroom as well as in it. So students can absorb that content, but then when they really need help, they are actually there with the physical teachers. As an example of some of these trends in action, there's a very nice example that I came across from Joanna Butler, and Joanna Butler is the Kansas State Librarian. She was Library Journal's 2013 Librarian of the Year, and she tells a story about being at the local airport a few years ago, and she was waiting at baggage claim, and what she saw when she looked around was lots of people looking at their phones. But what she saw when she saw those people looking at their phones were lots of potential readers. She wanted to work out how she could shift that focus from a phone and interacting with things like Facebook or games to shifting that focus to reading. The result of that was the Books on the Fly campaign, and that initially kicked off at the Manhattan Regional Airport. And basically what they do is they have QR codes around the airport that someone can scan as they're walking through the airport, and it sends them to the Kansas State Library's e-lending service. If you're not a member of the service, then it automatically redirects you to Project Gutenberg's mobile optimized site, where they're invited to download books that have passed into the public domain. So that's just one example of some of these kinds of things in action when you're thinking about what is your community, what are the trends that are out there, what role have we got to play and what's happening in the environment. Now, it's fair to say that in all of this, there are a huge number of unknowns. So while we can make some educated guesses on what will happen, we need to also equip ourselves for the future as well. So skills for the future is another area where there are a lot of generic ideas about what's going to be useful. In this case, though, I would say that probably a lot of those generic ideas about what's useful for the future are actually correct. So skills like adaptability and resilience, they are important right now. They're also really difficult to learn. I wanted to add, though, some other skills that perhaps aren't talked about as much when we're thinking about planning and preparing ourselves for the future of the library. So thinking about a few of the new skills. The first one is storytelling. So while the language that decision makers understand today is the language of value and dollars and economics, the mythology of storytelling and telling a good story to illustrate your point can be really devastating. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the ability of a good story to get across the kind of value that we do provide. Secondly, understand what the user experience is and understanding how to gain information on that user experience. So getting feedback on the user experience isn't something that you should be doing every 5 years. And I think we've gotten very trapped into this idea that that's what we do. We need to know how to get insights from those who use the service. And it's not just enough to know what they want, but we also need to know how do they feel. How do they feel when they're accessing that service, and how do we want them to feel? How do they experience that entire service that we're offering? The third new skill is about designing and pitching services for the digital native. Now, as we know, the digital native is not the same as the digitally literate. So pitching services for the digitally native is quite different. Think about this when you're designing interfaces and when you're designing programs and when you're offering services. Remember that the digital native tends to think that they can get their news from Google and they will get everything that they will ever need from Google. So when we're pitching and designing services, we need to be thinking about how we appeal to that mindset. The fourth new skill, which probably isn't really a new skill, but I think is worth saying anyway, is about getting your hands dirty. So personally, we need to get involved with technology and with data and with hacking and with making. As a profession, we need to spend time getting ourselves and keeping ourselves up to date. And that means experimenting and tinkering and thinking critically about some of these trends that are coming towards our library that we may be expected to provide. Number 5 is about understanding the wide world of government, social services and digital citizenship. I think this has been something that's been often viewed as a preserve for the public library, but actually it's becoming increasingly important that all of us can help our customers to navigate this area, not just in the world of the public library. The 6th new skill is around being comfortable where your customers are. John Sutter has said that librarians must venture into the digital space where their potential patrons exist to show them why the physical library is still necessary. And I think this has been really well illustrated by organisations that have used things like Minecraft to actually interact with patrons in a digital space. Britain's Library Report has stated that the 21st century librarian will need to be more of a community impresario with digital and commercial experience who can champion their community's needs. So for the future, I wanted to leave you with a quote about the role of libraries in the future. If we remember Rolly Keating, who is the director of the British Library, he said, "What we collectively believe libraries are and are for
will determine what form they survive in. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Laurinda. And now I'll unmute everybody in case there are any questions from people. Feel free to shout out. That is always a good sign if there are no questions. You've given a very comprehensive presentation.
I think the thing I would just probably say to wrap up is that I think that kind of, equation that I talked about how we might think about the libraries is really important. But I think also it's just really important to think really critically about all of the trends. There's so much information and so much stuff coming at us constantly about what might happen in our future. We do have to be really selective and whittle down and think critically about what are the things that are really likely to happen and are likely to have an impact on my community.
Cool. Great, well thank you very much, Laurinda. I really appreciated hearing that, and thank you to everybody for attending. And we will be, we have been recording this, so we'll be posting this on our YouTube channel if there are any highlights or bits that you would like to go back to or revisit at any stage.
Great, thanks Laurinda, thanks Joanna. Yeah.